It's just about to go. Amazing. Hello, everybody. I am here with Elisha Daeva, dear friend, author of the book Before War, and I am excited to have this chat
Me too.
because it's a beloved topic of mine. It's always edgy, and it's also as a Gemini, right in my season as a lover of information and knowledge. This is one of those
Mm.
wormholes of which there is no bottom to be found, or at least without a time machine, this is at best well argued, well-intentioned speculation, but there's I think one of my own personal attractions to this topic is the fact that it can't ever be fully known for sure, but I think there is a lot we can pull from the historical record. There's a lot we can pull from many of the well-kept sacred traditions that span the gap from prehistory into the modern era. And so there's a lot that we can gain from looking back and comparing that to where we are now. And there's also a lot we can lose
Mm.
by looking back to certain ideas, certain concepts, and trying to force a certain version of reality into the modern era. So there's something to be gained and something to be lost by looking backwards, and we're hoping to gain the right things and lose the right things. So here is my friend Elisha Daeva. And yeah, I would love for you to tee off the conversation of what we're here to discuss and, where you come at that conversation from.
So I've been researching pre-patriarchal societies for 30 years for the book Before War, which here it is. It's a sexy cover.
I love it.
On marriage, matriarchy, and our marriage hierarchy and our matriarchal origins. And so it's kind of like my obsession because once when I was 22 and learned that we used to exist without domination and some people lording over others and war and all of those things that we kind of take for granted that we learn sort of through osmosis that are just inevitable, it changed my life because I'd always felt like there's something wrong here and I can't put my finger on it. Like, why was teenage sex so bad and why were the boys so mean to us and why was I expected to clean up the dishes after my family dinners while the boys were, having political conversations and
Mm,
why is there war and why are there there's oil being dumped in the ocean and all of those things finally made sense from a perspective of this is an institution with a package, I call it the patriarchy package of things that go together, a set of ideologies that all fit together and that took thousands of years really to fully take hold, but history is written by the victors. And so all we have now is this idea that almost every culture on earth is part of this ideology. And it has nothing to do with blaming men, which is what the sort of men's rights organization have kind of spread the idea that the conversation about patriarchy is about blaming men. But I don't see it that way at all because I see a lot of women perpetuating patriarchy, and I see a lot of men like yourself being a great example, pointing out the reasons why it doesn't work and the reasons why the alternative would benefit us all, including men, especially men, because men are so affected by it in a negative way, which is becoming even more clear right now because I believe we can't even understand anything about human nature unless we understand these dynamics and the way
mm,
that they affect the way we think and affect our feelings about ourselves, our insecurity, our mental health. And so one of my obsessions is around cycles because I believe things go in cycles. I've seen that throughout my tracking
Mm.
of history, and my book tracks the way that the pendulum swings between
Mm.
more sexy, kind of permissive cycles and cycles of authoritarianism, which always go hand in hand with male dominance. And so, even if men are in charge and they think they they are benefiting from the system, they're still subject to the stronger men, the more dominant men, the more violent men. So that's why it benefits men too to have a more egalitarian system. And right now, the impetus for this conversation and the reason why I was so excited to talk with you is that the pendulum is swinging hard back towards re-maintaining patriarchy after we've had a really good run of deconstructing that, of feminism, which some could argue has gone into some directions that have been harmful. I don't necessarily agree with that, although that's been repeated so many times that a lot of people believe it, and I'm open to it. We're seeing this pendulum swing really hard with the rise of the manosphere, and I think it's a matter of extreme concern because an entire generation is being re-brainwashed with those same dynamics wrapped up into sexy new rappers.
Yeah. Wow, thank you for that. You just laid out so much so perfectly. And I'm gonna try and track my way through a few bits and pieces of it because I actually just had this insight I've never had
Mm,
before, or like put two things together, which is to preface what I'm about to say, with a lot of the work I do privately, working with people with somatic healing and spiritual
mm,
awakening, and
mm,
a hot topic in the collective conversation, thank God, around the healing process is what has now come to be known as CPTSD, or complex PTSD, which is similar to PTSD, except for that it happens either so early and or so pervasively that you don't have a self before the incident. And so, like, with regular PTSD, like, I'm a person, I have an identity, I understand myself, then a certain event happens and
mm,
now I'm different, and the healing process is in a way trying to get back to a version of myself before the trauma.
mhm,
Versus with CPTSD, what you hear people talk about, and I can like relate to this from my own story, it's like I'm trying to get back to something that I never had.
mm,
And it's like I don't even really quite know what it is. And as you were talking about, the rise of patriarchy, the prehistoric matriarchal ways of being, like that's what came up in my body. Is it's like, oh my God, we're all so completely lost. Like we have collective CPTSD
mm,
in regards to this way of being, because I'm hearing you talk about it and talk about like how the patriarchal paradigm is so completely pervasive and
mm,
no one can remember anything before it,
mm,
that it's like it's the water we swim in. And it's so hard even for me as someone who's like
mm,
ardently and passionately into this conversation.
mm,
It's like I'm trying to get back to this thing that only exists in stories, or only exists in dreams, only exists in like my imagination.
yeah.
But my body, like, I can't find it anywhere in my body. And it is this like very fascinating process of trying to get back to something that nobody can remember. And and I think that feels really relevant to what we're talking about now. Um, I think that feels really relevant to what we're talking about now, because in the personal healing process, something that's really common with moving through that kind of trauma is because you're going so far into the unknown, because
Mm,
you're trying to reclaim something that you don't even really have knowledge of, there's such a
mhm.
high tendency for recidivism.
Yes.
Like, oh, this is so unknown, this is so scary, this is so unfamiliar. My somatic body has no reference point for where I'm going,
Yeah.
and where I used to be feels so much safer, so much more inviting, so much more known. Like,
Yeah.
like one of my teachers always says, the ego will always choose a familiar hell over an unfamiliar heaven. And so I feel like in this present moment, there's, this the whole evolution of feminism over the last 100 years. There's a lot of things that are emerging into more freedom. And
Mm.
there's like also tons of backlash because collectively we're all in this place of
Yeah.
like, oh my God, we're stepping into something and I have no idea what it is. And where we were feels safer, even if we know it sucks.
Yeah, exactly. I think about that a lot. I know a lot of people who seem like, and even see in myself ways that I cling to certain negativities because it's so familiar. It's just like, oh, let me just relax into giving up hope that I'll ever heal this and
Uh-huh.
just embrace the misery or something. But actually, a big part of Before War, and as well my memoir, Wild Thing in Captivity, is the somatic practice that I've done all my life and also do with clients, which has to do with using rhythm and breath in nature
Mm.
combined with plant medicines to reach a state of trance by drowning out the internal dialogue with a rhythm. And I also do Qinat Sang, which is a Chinese abdominal massage. So by placing my hands on people's abdomens, they often discharge that trauma. And in the book, based on a book called Saharasia by James DeMio, traces the origins of patriarchy to a particular environmental trauma, which was the very rapid desertification of the entire region from North Africa into Central Asia that may have
Mm.
turned from a rainforest to a desert in as little as 100 years, starting around 4,000 years, 4,000 BC.
Uh-huh.
So that kind of like prolonged trauma and lack of resources is the necessary precondition towards this system. And I had a huge insight like at the end of writing the book, the reason why there's so much taboo around sex and patriarchy. Well, it's because of paternity, because in matrilineal cultures you don't keep track of the father, and the kids belong to the mother's clan,
Hmm.
um, and are raised by the father figure in their life is the mother's brother, and of course the grandmother and the aunts and everything. And so in that system, not having to worry about keeping track of paternity, there's no reason to control sexuality. But also in a desert situation where resources are scarce, it takes so much more resource to raise a child. So there's so much more stress around it. And that suppression of our natural sexual urge is what creates psychopathology and child abuse, and then that just perpetuates the trauma generation after generation and the suppression of trauma release. So it becomes shameful to, ecstatic dance,
Yeah.
drumming, shamanic practices are suppressed. And that makes people very easy to control by authoritarian regimes. And then, like you were saying, the complex PTSD, it's some of it may even be epigenetic. We're
Hmm.
finding that science is finding now it's stored in our tissues, and it may not even be something that we personally experienced, but an ancestral or transpersonal trauma.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Um, if I understand correctly, because this like really dovetails with my own, you know, probably very unscientific personal investigation of where the hell did the patriarchy come from. Like where I ended up is really like the birthplace of agriculture, and which is shortly after what you're talking about, the desertification of northern Africa, right? Because tell me if I'm tracking this all correctly. Because food was suddenly so much less abundant, we had to turn to caretaking the earth. And even on the energetic level of like talking about, so-called masculine leadership versus feminine leadership, like when the earth is abundant, when food is abundant, no one really needs to lead anything. It's all just, I just punched my microphone. It's all just emerging, right? There's food, there's people, and there's food, and there's no real problem. You don't need a lot of hyper organized structures. And then as food becomes scarce, we turned to tending the land, And like that was the moment I kind of locked in on when we started tending the land. All of a sudden hierarchy emerges because we're like, hold on, if we're going to spend all this time cultivating this particular patch of land to yield enough food, then whose land is it? Oh, well, it's my land. And if it's my land, then I need to to delineate what's mine and what's not mine. So now we've got like boundaries, now we've got walls. If I've got this land that's producing food and other people don't, now I need armies, now I need soldiers, now I need, state instituted violence to protect my food from the people, the other people who might want it. And then if this is my piece of land and I'm eventually going to die, who's going to get the land after me? Well, it better be my son, not someone else's son. So, like you said, that's where all of a sudden paternity becomes really, really important because there is that primal drive to continue your own genetic line. And so, whether or not anyone was conscious of this on that level, if I'm going to fight my whole life to get this chunk of land to produce food, and I'm going to fight my whole life to keep other people from taking our food, then it's like, oh, I want to make sure this goes to my child. So suddenly I really care about your virginity. Suddenly I really care about you not sleeping with anyone who's not me, so that I can guarantee that my line continues on this. And it's really this like super prime biological drive that got corrupted by scarcity and borders and hierarchy. And yeah, it's so fascinating. And then I'm like, well, shit, we can't really undo any of that. So here we are in the modern age, 6,000 years later.
So a lot of what you say is right according to the evidence, and it's actually the most common view of those people who actually admit that patriarchy exists and that it didn't always. In other words, that
Hmm.
it's not just the way of nature. Most people think that the way you do that, agriculture is the culprit, including the book Sex at Dawn, which many of us have read,
Uh-huh.
that where an entire quarter of the book is actually dedicated to talking about patriarchal dynamics around sex because they recognize that that's a major component in monogamy and all of our like mating structures. But there were more thousands of years of agricultural goddess egalitarian civilization than there have been patriarchy. So
Mhm.
basically, from the dawn of agriculture around 8,000 BC up until 3,500 BC, when the patriarchal nomads overran the agricultural goddess civilizations of the Near East, was an egalitarian agricultural civilization in which land was owned collectively by the clans. And it was pastoral lifestyles that led to patriarchy. So it was about the cows. So what you said about like
Mm.
to control resources and pass them down to your sons, that was true of the pastoral cultures, basically the steppe nomads from the Russian steppes, where patriarchy first arose, and it was about being able to hoard the herds, which
Mm.
because the land was so dry, agriculture wasn't even possible. So it was just about animals. And that was a resource that was very easy to control. And that led to cattle raiding. And then raiding led to sort of battles. And then that led to sort of war parties. And then that led to sort of like once you train young men for war, they want to use it and come up with more and more reasons for using it. And so that slowly grew into the war machine. And then there were chariots, and then it was just fucked.
Yeah. Like they say, if all you have is a hammer, everything becomes
Exactly.
a nail.
Right.
And yeah, it does kind of seem like there was this pivotal transition point where I think particularly on the masculine side of things, we became a cold hard steel blade
Yeah,
or a hammer. And then the solution to everything from that point forwards is state instituted violence,
exactly.
which is
And
like to me one of the defining characteristics of patriarchy is obviously in this incarnation of the metaverse, men have all the power, but it's of course in some ways it is about gender, but it's also it could be the same thing with women in charge, and it would be just as horrible. But like the real thing to me is like the use of state instituted violence, and this is how I've heard a lot of other people kind of define things as once ownership starts to happen, whether it's cattle or land or women or resources, then there's the necessitated use of violence to protect what's mine.
I mean, it depends on what you mean by ownership. It seemed that people in the Neolithic times owned their own tools. You know, they were ceramicists or hunters, or, you know, they were buried with their own tools.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's possible to have, you know, certain types of ownership without having all of the patriarchal war stuff. And technically there we don't know of any situations where women were in charge in which these dynamics of war and genocide prevailed and things were just as horrible, not because women are good and men are bad, but because when women's sexual strategy prevails, meaning that women get to decide who they have sex with instead of
Hmm.
men getting to decide, that there is a core difference between men and women, which is that men are hornier on average. I mean, women are a lot hornier, like in non-patriarchal cultures where they're not sex shamed into coyness because of paternity and conditioned that way. But still, there is this difference, and women's bodies are sort of more sought after, and that creates a like a biological power differential. And I think that's why there's so much virulent hate and vitriol towards women from like the manosphere, from sort of like the bitter, lonely men who have just broken up with their ex and are sort of like absorbing all this manosphere stuff, which is designed to invoke their hatred of women in order to sell them, you know, workshops and stuff. Um, but it's because of this like deep down feeling of like, fuck, women really have the power because we want them so much more than they need us, really,
Mm.
to a certain degree. And so when women get to choose who they have sex with, when women are in charge of sexual selection, pretty much usually the guys are psyched, like, okay. Whereas if it's the other way around and men are in charge, whether deciding who their sons can marry and who their daughters can marry and controlling that whole system, it leads to coercion of women
Hmm.
because women aren't usually as psyched. And once you have coercion, it's basically slavery, and it just creates that whole system of oppression.
Yeah, and that right there is already like starting the cycle of passing on epigenetic trauma.
Exactly.
So it's right there in the foundation of the entire paradigm. And what's coming up for me, and this is potentially a really epic rabbit hole. So we'll see how far into this we want to go. And then I do want to like pivot to the present moment and where we are
Yeah.
now. But I could talk about the origins of things forever. And like one of the pieces I've been honing in on, like especially coming from a male perspective and like really trying to understand like where did this, like you said, there's this covert or overt hatred of the feminine or fear of the feminine, that this need to control, this need to like make her mine, to speak personally and collectively. Um, and especially as someone who's been very deep in the practice of Tantra for the last decade, there's a deep reverence and worship of the feminine, which is married to a lot of practices around deeply, genuinely making peace with your own mortality, your own death, your own
Mm,
finitude.
mm,
And like what I notice is those things are absolutely joined at the hip,
mm,
because what I see or what I imagine when I like project myself back in time, and at some point in human history, the sense of self, the sense of I, the sense of individuality comes online,
mm,
the self-awareness enters into the living experience, and
mm,
suddenly I know that I'm a thing, and also that this thing is going to end.
Mm-hmm.
And then I problematically identify with this thing that's
Mm-hmm.
going to end. And I think that's one of the things driving that thing of needing my line to continue. It's one of the ways that the ego perpetuates itself is through replication. So I can't live forever, but I can replicate outwards through, that's like to me, one of the defining characteristics of ego is that it's always trying to self-replicate. You can see it in social movements, you can see it in religions, you can see it, like the goal of ego is to make everybody like me. And then in a way I'm immortal. And the goal of ego is like, oh, my body won't live forever, but my son will have, he's kind of me, and I'm going to shape him in my image. And then
Mm-hmm.
he's going to have a son and shape him in his image, which is also my image. And you can see, this paternalistic deification of self that we also then project upwards to, the white bearded guy in the sky who made us in his image. And so the ego is always trying to remake the world in its own image. And we project that onto, the Abrahamic God, who also had conveniently the very same strategy. And so when you talk about the women being in charge of the sexual reproduction strategy and getting to choose their own methods, like I can almost feel that biological genetic ego thing that's like, wait, but hold on. I need to make sure that my image continues to replicate into the world.
Yeah, so before paternity became this obsession, men's image replicated through the world through their sisters' children,
Hmm.
which were almost as related to them on average as one's own biological offspring. Genetically speaking, are almost as related, but are most definitely related. Whereas, you know, you can't be sure whether your partner was faithful to you during that time. So y- your your sister's children are carrying on your line genetically, in every way. But that individualistic urge, I believe, and this is kind of a theory, and it's not only me theorizing it, but that this kind of individualism was connected with patriarchy, was part of this cycle, also happens to dovetail with the Kali Yuga cycle, the Iron Age. And
Hmm.
some people believe that the sort of like Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh was sort of like the first literature which featured this totally new brain state. Some people think it was like more of a left brain consciousness of the individual ego of Gilgamesh, I am king,
Mm.
as opposed to before, that Neolithic goddess civilizations did collective burials most of the time. So they basically exposed the bodies to be excarnated by vultures and then took all the bones and buried them under the house. So it was like this idea of, and then, the tombs were shaped like, when they had tombs later, they were shaped like wombs. So one imagines that there was this idea of regeneration in the goddess, and their imagery around death and excarnating these bodies was of dancing and celebration. So
Mm.
perhaps there wasn't this fear of death, and there wasn't this obsession with one's individual lineage. And then during patriarchy is when we see these important men getting buried with all of this loot and treasure and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like so much better. As I hear you describing that, I can feel the part of me that's like, yeah, please take me back to, or
Mm.
like, please bury me outside where the crows can eat my flesh and then do something cool with my bones. And then everybody dance under the moonlight around a fire and celebrate the fact that life exists.
Pretty
Like,
much.
I'm, yeah, I like that a lot more than whatever we do now. Put me in a pretty box and pretend that death doesn't happen.
And take up valuable real estate for all of these stones. And so the biggest project in my life, the most important thing to me, like my driving force, is actually the fictional book about the rise of patriarchy that I've been working on for 20 years.
Ooh.
And I only have written parts of it in trance, when I'm in trance and I just channel it. But it's like you were saying, like, how can we go back without a time machine? We can't even remember this. And that's why my dream in life is to have this be made into a movie. And so I spend a lot of my time trying to imagine, without patriarchal programming, what would little aspects of life have been like? And this was such a long standing, normal, default aspect of humanity. And we see little glimpses of it on screen in something like Avatar, with the sort of paradise planet and stuff like that.
Uh-huh.
And there's only one other person who's written fiction that is set during this time, Mary Mackey. And I'm trying not to read it again because I really want mine to be, coming directly from source. But
Uh-huh.
like thinking about things like, how would you learn about sex? Like, how would you first experiment with sex? Would there be public sex? And like, because there was public sex like in the South Pacific, which didn't turn patriarchal until the European colonization. Like, that there's ancient Greek historians speak of the matrilineal cultures around them having like it was orgiastic. And
Uh-huh.
so, like, what would that be like to grow up in that? What would your taboos be? Like, what would your swear words be? Like, what would your what would be your biggest problem in life without, like, you know, would you feel sexual jealousy? Like, just, everything that we have in our culture that we take for granted as being natural is actually part of this ideology, and trying to imagine what life would have been like before it.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And I'm like, right now I'm laughing at the irony that the whole main thing that birthed this conversation between us was the tension between atavism and activism. And to quickly loosely define those in this context, atavism is essentially the movement or the belief that our best times are in the past and we
Mm,
need to figure out how to get back to them. And in activism being the belief that our best times are in the future and we need to
mm,
figure out how to get to those. And while I'm definitely like aligned with most activism causes of the progressive left and the feminist movement, from a tantric standpoint, actually both of those things are a problem.
mm,
The belief that the best of life has already happened or that the best of life is yet to come both disconnect me from being right here in this moment where life is actually happening. And I say that because as you're talking about, this imagining of what life would be like if we still lived in that way, I can feel the part of me that's like, oh yeah, take me back there, please. Which is like, even though the direct point of conflict we're getting to, and I want to kind of pivot there now, perhaps, is this atavistic movement currently underway that's essentially anti-feminism. So there's this like strong feminism movement that is progressive and activist,
mm,
and then there's this strong anti-movement which is regressive and atavistic. And so I more identify with the activist forward moving side of things, but in this movement, I'm like, oh yeah, take me back, but not just back to the 1950s as the current counter movement is kind of putting on the wall as a target, but I can feel the part of my animal body that's like, oh my God, that way of being feels so much more delicious to me than what we're doing now. So, on that note, I guess we'll pivot to the present moment. Here we are. There's been this strong progressive activist movement of feminism for the last 100 or so years, or maybe it's been happening ever since the patriarchy was born and it finally has momentum. Um, and then, of course, there's to every movement, there's a counter movement, and there's this whole um, backlash or counter swing or um, re-emerging of, hashtag tradwife, This iconization of the 1950s housewife kind of thing. And to like the first thing I notice when I feel into that is it feels like it's once again true to form of healing from CPTSD. It's trying to return to something that never really existed. Like this 1950s black and white TV paradigm of what masculine is and what feminine is, like it at best really only existed for like 10 years. And this perfect ideal that people have in their minds, it's almost like they're tapping into something that is yet to exist and might be worth pursuing, like some kind of like beautiful, harmonious relationship between masculine and feminine that's like both honoring each other. And but it's looking back to the past and trying to recreate something that really like I don't think ever actually existed. So I'm curious to hear your input on the present moment clash of forward versus backwards.
Yeah, hopefully this conversation is going to be the start of the counter movement to the counter movement. Um, and it is happening. I'm seeing a lot of videos in my feed that are countering the trad wife manosphere. Interestingly, like the manosphere seems to have like a disproportionate amount of African American men, and the counter movement to that seems to have a disproportionate amount of African American women countering it, which is interesting. And 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 men, a lot of men countering it. There's one guy, God, what's his can't remember his YouTube name. I can post it. He's great. He's like he's like recovering manosphere, like as a young, lonely, horny guy, which is kind of the target audience. He, became brainwashed into this cult of masculinity. You have to be tougher and stronger and go to the gym, and then you'll get the chicks and you'll get the Maserati and you'll be happy. And then as he deconstructed that, he realized it was making him really unhappy because you could never be masculine enough. There's always going to be someone more masculine than you, someone who suppresses their emotions more, and he's pointing out that the reason why men's mental health is so endangered right now is because of these ideals of masculinity. They can never measure up, and it doesn't encourage them to express their emotions. It encourages them to suppress them and to not have community support. So there's a lot of men who are coming out of the manosphere who are saying like, this is how it affected me, and I chose community and real relationships with real human women instead, of trying to have as much sex as I can to just prove my status to other men, and put down women and dehumanize others in order to make myself feel better. So that the counter movement is happening, but I mean, my personal superpower is that I see patterns, and so I tend to be this Cassandra, like, you guys, this is a big problem. Like they're brainwashing an entire generation of young women into not creating a career for themselves and an income for themselves because, first of all, in the 50s the American pie was a lot bigger and there's a lot
Hmm.
fewer people trying to get slices of it. So like on a middle class income, one income could support a family. Nowadays, how many people can actually do that just on a logistical economic level?
Right.
And then, not to mention the fact that, if you forego your creation of income and skills in your youth, then you're completely dependent on somebody. And it's especially if you're like dependent on somebody who really wanted a submissive wife, like that's already a red flag of a certain type of controlling, sort of psychologically damaged person. And so now, luckily, there are some of these iconic trad wives who sort of were grifters and ironically, made a bunch of income on selling their image, with the little apron and everything. And that are now like being abused by their husbands and saying, "Oh, I get $30, allowance a week, and I have no car, and I'm stuck here all day, and he abuses me." And so hopefully that is getting out there for young women to know that it's not necessarily safe to be completely dependent on someone. And I'm all for choosing that lifestyle if a couple decides that that is their best bet, if he has better earning potential and she's more nurturing and wants to work in the home and they can find some kind of a trade that doesn't bleed over into actual submission dynamics. And especially for mature women to choose that, I see the allure of being paid for. Of course, nobody wants to work. So I'm total and the choice to raise children is an absolutely beautiful choice, and how much better to be able to spend time with them than to farm that out and pay someone else to do it. So I totally honor that choice. I just don't like the fact that you have like footballers or whoever that are telling college graduates like your most important thing that you could possibly, the only important thing for you as a woman starts when you have kids and are subject to your husband.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like I think that's really where for me the sticking point is because similar to what you said, I'm all aboard everybody doing whatever the hell they want. If it's like informed and consensual.
Yeah.
Like some people might be like, I want to be in charge all the time. And
Mm.
someone else might be like, I don't ever want to be in charge.
Yeah.
And it's like great. And sure, like maybe there's some psychological stuff there they both want to look at, maybe not. Maybe there's some like, mental health things going on. I don't know. I can't say. But like if that's genuinely what two people want, good for you. Like I hope it works. What the like my real rub with the whole trad wife hyper polarity movement is how much it's putting out this very specific paradigm as what all women and all men should be doing
Exactly.
with the subtle or overt implication that if you aren't doing this, you aren't actually a real man or a real woman, that your value as a man is entirely determined by how much of a kingdom you can build, and your value of a woman is entirely defined by how much of a family you can build. And like lovely, like I love families and kingdoms sound wonderful. I have one. I would also like the other. but,
Oh, you have
it
kids?
like I have kids, yeah. I have two daughters and they're amazing and they've been my biggest teachers and they were certainly like what spurred me into a more feminist position in life. I had two little beings that I loved that were, of female
Mm.
orientation and started looking at the world and I was like, "Oh shit. This is not what I want for them."
Mm.
And that really like the last 13 years of that has really created this big alignment for me with the
Mhm.
feminine as like a advocate for feminism and women's rights and worship of the goddess and all these things. But anyways, all that is to say, like one of the things I've been tracking actually when it comes to men is that this polarity movement, this trad wife movement is, as you've said, severely damaging to men's health, especially men's mental health. Like, yes, physical health. Everyone's out there just hustling and grinding all day long, like running their body into the ground, trying to make a buck. And granted, that's somewhat inescapable at this point in late stage capitalism. But also, I remember seeing an article a little while ago where all the suicide, like someone had analyzed a bunch of suicide letters from men, and the
Mm.
number one word that came up was worthless. Like it's all on me to build a kingdom, and I can't do it. So I guess I'm just gonna punch my own ticket because I can't do the one thing I'm supposed to do. And I would imagine even though suicide rates are lower for women, I would imagine there's a similar wound. Like when this single ideal is held up as like the only thing you're supposed to be, that just it works for a certain percentage of people, and everyone else is left with, self-loathing or self-judgment or lack of value or even, externally reflected judgment and all of these things. So there's this, from a I guess like from an altruistic standpoint, I look at this paradigm playing out in the collective and I'm like, oh my God, it's hurting so many people. even if it
Mm.
works for some people, even if some people are genuinely happy in this, like again, if it actually works for certain people, like great. But the idea that everyone should be doing this is causing so much harm.
Exactly. I'm all for choice. You do you. But it would be disingenuous to suggest that the trad wife influencers, or even more virulently hateful, some of the manosphere influencers, aren't saying like, no, this is for everybody, and if you're not doing this, you're doing it wrong. And shaming the women for high body counts and all this other super cultic. When you hear this language over and over again, you're dealing with a cult and a
Hmm.
cult ideology. And unfortunately, that's been in deep in the neo tantra movement for a long time, at least since David Data.
Hmm.
I've been deep in the well, I was deep in the tantra world. I kind of dropped out. I did drop out. I haven't really been doing any, like, going to any of them. I went to Agama for 3 winters, and um, back in the day, and all the global workshops and festivals and stuff, and it's like I had to stop because I was seeing this polarity ideology turn from like what I think polarity is about, which is like cultivating that dynamic chi between two people, and that dynamic push pull. It's like, what do you do when I do this to you? And then what will you do to me? It's like an interplay, as opposed to this, if you are a man, you must be the dominating one who is initiating all of the movement and the woman is receiving it. It's just like, that is so fucking boring. Like for me sexually, like, which is only like literally like swipe left on someone who's purely dom or purely sub. Like, come on, like, let's do something else. Let's play a different game. Like, I can play that game, that's fun, and then let's do something different. And so unfortunately, the neo tantra movement got just too too much of that,
Yeah.
and there's so much more to life. And now I forgot what else I was talking about.
Great. Well, thankfully, there also seems to be a correction underway in the
Mm.
Neo-Tantra movement, something that I am doing my very best to participate in in this conversation in many other ways of both like starting to question whether or not that's a great paradigm to push with so much certainty, and also there seems to slowly be a return of people that are starting to have the awareness that classical tantra is in fact very, very different than what we've all been told. And so I have the somewhat unique position that I actually started out exposed to classical tantra first.
Mm.
So that
Mm.
was my foundation, and then I've certainly played the field in the neo tantra world as well. And there's a lot of great stuff happening there. I'm all for
Mm.
a return to the reclamation of sexuality and for understanding how we can practice and develop that in ways that are healing and
Mm.
enlivening and contribute to our awakening, but like coming from a true understanding of what classical tantra actually is about, which has almost nothing to do with sex. So there seems to be a movement happening in the field that I'm happy about, where a lot of people in the neo tantra space are like, oh, hey, hold on, there's like a lot more going on here than I was told, and it seems worth investigating. And most of the people I know who are kind of headed that direction, when they really get a taste of actual pure tantric
Mm.
transmission, they're like, oh,
Mm.
this is whoa. It's so much juicier and sexier, even if it has almost nothing to do with juice or sex. And
Mm.
so that's wonderful, and I'm glad that's happening. And now I've also forgotten whatever whatever I was gonna try and say. But we are getting close to having been chatting for a whole hour, and it felt like 5 minutes went by, and I could do this all day. But I want to try and land maybe somewhere practical.
Mhm.
Um, what would you say? Like maybe we'll start here for men in the literal and the archetypal sense. Like what do you think what shift is needed in how we view, how we relate to the feminine, both in embodied and archetypal forms? to move forwards in a better way?
I mean, first of all, I believe that what's natural for mammals is for females to choose an approach. So
Hmm.
I think it would just and it's going in the complete opposite direction to the pendulum swing now, which is men insisting and women who are also caught up in the polarity cult, insisting like, let the man choose you, and just be receptive and don't be too assertive, and just all, women are amplifying and passing on that conditioning. And it just, to me, it makes so much more sense because women are choosier, because sex and reproduction is a lot more biologically, metabolically expensive for women, and women have so fewer, you know, reproductive options. Women are
Hmm.
choosier biologically, and so therefore should be the ones to choose. And I mean, obviously, we know that women swipe right at a fraction of the amount of times that men do, and so it just would make sense for women to do the approaching, because then women aren't, overwhelmed with all of this approach from men that they're not choosing, and then it can even be dangerous to sort of turn them down. That's what I would love to see. But then men have been conditioned to think that if a woman is approaching them, that it's scary, or it's emasculating or something, and so they get scared and run away. So I don't know how to correct that, but it would just work so much better, if that were the case. And I don't know, maybe I'm weird. I mean, I am weird because I've spent so much time deconstructing patriarchy that like it places me in kind of an undateable category, but if like everybody is all conditioned in patriarchy. But I would just love to see men treating me like another human. Like a lot of women are caught up in this idea of like, oh, I want to be put on a pedestal and goddessized. I don't want that personally. I just want to, I don't know. I want to. I do love, the thing I love most about Tantra is when you can tap into that space together where you're transfiguring each other as God and Goddess. So I don't like this whole like, oh, put her on a goddess pedestal, and the man is just a man. Like, no, he's representing divine masculine, I'm representing divine feminine, and at the same time we're just sort of equal human beings who are trying to make the best of it.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to answer the same question because I want to.
What are you?
But like what's actually coming up for me that like as you were saying that and I was listening to you give your half of what needs to be different, then I'm like feeling into like, okay, then what needs to happen in men individually and collectively so that that can exist. And the two things that came up for me is we need to like go fuck ourselves and die. So so maybe that'll be my next 3 month container, go fuck yourself and die with Ben Raya. And what I mean is, first, when you're talking about women leading the choosing of sexual partnership or procreation, then like being in a male body and being steeped in male culture most of my life, there's this part of me that's like, oh, but like, hold on, what am I supposed to do with all my sexual urges, right? There's this conscious or unconscious sense of entitlement in the male body of like,
Mm,
I'm horny and that's your
mm,
problem. And what actually needs to happen is for men to really deeply turn towards their own sexual expression and to take ownership of my experience, to take ownership of my own body, to take ownership of my own energy and my own pleasure, and be like, cool, I can actually meet myself in a
mm,
beautiful, enjoyable, nourishing way.
mm.
And suddenly you're on the hook for so much less. And so that's the go fuck yourself part. And then the die part is like like maybe this is just my tantric bias coming through, which is fine because I think it's great. But it comes back so much to ego death, the need for ego death, or
Mm,
the need for disidentification with the small self, because that
mm,
is really like on the interpersonal level, men have all been conditioned out of their hearts, out of their bodies, out of their feelings, and then women, to put this patriarchal split back in place, this polarity, you're supposed to be in your body, in your feelings, in your sexuality, and I love you because you embody all the things I don't have. And I also hate you because you embody all the things I don't have. And I'm drawn to you because I want it, but also opening up to that forces me to face all the stuff I've been hiding from. So there's this like even on the interpersonal level, there's this simultaneous attraction and hatred, because it's like you open me and I love you for it and I hate you for it. But then even on the more archetypal or the transpersonal level, the dark feminine, as we call it these days, is the primordial wildness, the
mm,
ecstatic state, the trance state, which is
mm,
the state where the self vanishes. When you go into trance, when you go into ecstasy, whether it's like dancing around a moonlit fire or love making with a beloved, when you go into that state, the self can't can't come with you. So there is this like element of dying that needs to happen if we're actually going to be in right relationship to the feminine. To me, ego work is necessary. Like I can't enter into relationship with the thing that's going to demolish my identity without bringing hatred, unless that's like actually what I want. Like that is essentially the goddess orientation of tantric sadhana, is approaching the goddess or the feminine or the wildness of life itself from this point of like, yeah, I do want this small thing I call I
mm.
to die, or at least to be put in the back seat so that I can fully participate in what's actually happening right now, which is infinitely wild and vast and untamable and unknowable. And that's a hard process. So that's what I think we need to focus on.
I love that. And that really ties into Josh Schrai's kind of whole rant. And I talk about this a lot in Before War, that the pre-patriarchal cultures were, orgiastic and ecstatic and
Hmm.
shamanic. And so that survived into the historical period with the Eleusinian mysteries and the other mystery schools. That was kind of like the underground sort of secret mystery school tradition that went even more underground and even more underground, and then it was probably eliminated altogether by the witch burnings. Probably killed
Hmm.
off the last vestiges of that super ancient, hundreds of thousands of years old shamanic, ecstatic trance state, and more transpersonal perspective, as opposed to our individual ego identity minds, which are so small and so unwise compared to our transpersonal consciousness. And that gets me back to wanting to say a little bit more about the question we were both answering about what do I want from men. And I believe that during pre-patriarchal times, men were a lot hotter because there was no need for transactional sex. Because as you were saying, we each have been allotted only half of the human experience. You get to have the, doing thing, and we get to have the being and emotional thing. And so there's this resentment for the aspects of your humanity that you've been denied, in the same way that colonizer cultures, and this comes from my great teacher Martine Prechtel, who's one of the great influences of my life. Indigenous teaches the indigenous spirit, that the colonizers hate and destroy the colonized people because they are in touch with that greater trance mind and ecstatic
Hmm.
experience that that colonized cultures have stamped out of people to make them easier to control. And so what really turns me on in men is embodying that embodiment, that wildness, that sexiness, like even ironically in different cultures, even super patriarchal cultures like Arabic culture, the men, while being very masculine, also like move their shoulders and shake their hips when they dance and wear rings and wear bracelets in ways that Western men don't. And I'm very attracted to that, along with a certain type of um, backbone and moral strength. So like I believe that when we were mating just on the basis of sexual attraction and not needing to mate because we needed to have a man to provide for us, or for the man couldn't handle a household without a woman doing it for him. So when we were mating just on sexual attraction, that would have selected for much more attractive men. And I think that these lonely men that the whole manosphere has grown up to serve would get laid a lot more if they cultivated that feminine side. Ironically, instead of like, I mean, going to the gym and being a gymbo just doesn't appeal to me personally. So
Hmm.
like to cultivate and to learn how to flirt. Like what if there were like workshops where we taught each other how to flirt, just like put yourself out there in a fun and playful way, and then, wait for me to respond. Because I'm not saying like in women doing the choosing that means that men don't have sex. Like I really advocate for young men, these lonely men, to learn, like instead of having men tell them how to manipulate women, have women help them get better outfits, you know, exercise in more vital ways, get in touch with their wild side, but not their like Robert Bly wild side, but like their, divine ecstatic wild side.
Mm.
And that's what I would really love to see. And, young men with older women, because there's this whole like industry and this whole like crisis of masculinity because young men aren't getting laid and they feel entitled to it. But just as many women aren't getting laid, at least, especially if you look at the women over 40. And so this whole manosphere ideology that like, oh, women are all getting laid and men aren't, and men are expendable or whatever. When they think of women, they're only thinking of like 18 to 29-year-old hot girls. That's their entire sphere of women. There's a whole bunch of other human beings out there who are super lonely. The difference is we're not going out and shooting people over it, and we're not
Yeah.
feeling entitled to men's bodies.
Yeah. The entitlement piece, I think, is really big. And because yeah, there's this piece that needs to be acknowledged. I want to, throw a sympathetic bone to the collective masculine that for since, time immemorial, at least all the way back to when we started record keeping, and of course, as we've already established, there was, 5 times as much matriarchy before that. But for the last 6,000 to 10,000 years, relating has essentially happened from a place of overt or covert force. Like whether it was just directly forced, like, your dad sold you to me and now you're my wife, but even like economic force. Like so like the process of finding a mate has been driven so much by the fact that women absolutely needed a man for whether it was for protection from violent culture, whether it was because I can buy a house and you can't buy a house. Women couldn't even have their own like checking account until what was it, the 70s. So that's like 50 years ago. So there's all the like, and we've shifted into this place where women now have more economic freedom, more power, more all of these things. And it's like, oh, suddenly you don't need me actually, and it's on me to be desirable. And nobody for the most part has taught men what to do in this new landscape. And this is again back to that whole opening bit we talked about. I think that's part of why going back feels so inviting because it's like, oh, I know how to play that game.
Mhm.
I feel, consciously or subconsciously motivated to recreate the version of the world where you need me. And then it's a lot easier for me to get a mate and get some action and get a wife and get some kids. And so I think we are in this like very turbulent, rocky, emergent birthing of a new world where it's like, oh, it's actually it's once again on men to know how to play the game, to know how to be desirable. And I don't want to make that like shallow and judgy, like, oh, you have to be hot, you have to be rich, you have to be all these things. But it is like a monumental paradigm shift where it's like, oh, I can't just kind of leverage you into a relationship. It's 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 now me who's, peacocking essentially, and you get to say yes or no. So yeah, that's maybe we need more workshops around flirting. I'm a Gemini, so this is my wheel. This is
I
my
would love to see
wheelhouse.
you do that because I think that's what it comes down to. And I do have empathy for men at the carpet's been pulled out under under them. It's like,
Hmm.
okay, this is what you're conditioned to do. All you got to do is like have a good job and you'll be allotted a woman who needs you. And now it's like, whoa, different game. Like, and so that's why I would just love to see instead of like, okay, women are fucked, feminism is fucked, they ruined it for me, fuck those bitches. Like, okay, let's collaborate on how to learn to dance and learn to have a conversation and learn how to flirt and get better yoga pants.
Amazing. I love that. So yeah, we need ego death, we need emotional attunement, body practices, regular access to the ritualized state. I'm so glad you named Josh Schrei. And for people who aren't familiar with him, he does a podcast called The Emerald, which is absolutely brilliant. And I was planning to name him at some point anyways, because his work with The Emerald has been deeply impactful for me of like really like putting together all the pieces and finding a cohesive narrative, and his insights are so deep and profound, and his work has deeply touched me and my ability to communicate a lot of these things more clearly. So
Mm,
gratitude to him. If you haven't heard The Emerald, go listen to it. Especially
mm,
the episode on the forest feels particularly relevant to this conversation.
mm.
And yeah, we could go on forever, and maybe we'll have to do part two, three, four, five of this. But I think we should call it here. Are there any final closing thoughts, insights that you would like to make, or ways that people can get more deeply in touch with you and your work, what you do, how they can work with you? If someone is moved by this conversation and wants to participate in the evolution of the emerging paradigm.
Hmm. So beforewar.com is my website about the book, and you can contact me there if you want to do some of this trance trauma release stuff, or if you want to do a conversation like this. I've been wanting to have conversations. I have a series of conversations with men about these issues of the manosphere and healing. So yeah, beforewar.com. Thanks so much. This was great.
Amazing. And I am Ben Raya. You know where to find me. I'm here on Facebook all too often. And if anything in this, for especially for the men, has sparked a desire to lean into these edges, that is what I do with men. And my partner and I both work with couples also. So
Mm.
there are many avenues where we can create a more beautiful, abundant, ecstatic, sexy future. That's my goal. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks, Elisha, for being with me. This has been wonderful, and I hope we do more. Thank you.
So grateful for your work.
Mwah.